At least the introduction of my study this afternoon. There were some disciples of John that were following after him, one of those being Andrew, which we know now to be Simon Peter's brother. Andrew was with John whenever he saw Jesus, and he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And so Andrew heard what John had to say, and that kind of sets us up where we are at this moment. Andrew, of course, was a fisherman. He was a fisherman along with his brother Peter. We also know that James and John were fishermen as well. And we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 4 after that encounter with John the Baptist. In Matthew chapter 4 and verse 18, it says, "And Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Then he said to them, 'Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men.' They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him." So what we have here is a case where Jesus, who John has already identified as the Lamb of God, is coming to where they were doing the work that they were raised to do, that they had probably done for many, many years. And at that point, he says, "Come and follow me," both to Peter and Andrew and to James and John. Now, James and John were even there with their father, so they had learned how to be fishermen from their father. But Jesus says, "Come and follow me." And notice that they immediately left the boat, they left their nets, they left their father, and they followed after him. What they became in that moment was a disciple. And so what we are going to talk about this afternoon is the idea of being a disciple, what that means, and what that means to each of us since we are disciples of Jesus Christ. As a Tulsa Church of Christ, what are we doing to promote discipleship as disciples of Christ? In order to do that, we need to understand what that even means. What does it mean to be a disciple? Well, Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, we see the concept, in matter of fact, of what Jesus just did with Peter, Andrew, James, and John. In Mark 8 and verse 34, he says, "When he had called the people to himself, with his disciples also, he said to them, 'Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.'" Now notice he was already with some of his disciples, but that's really not who he's addressing here. He says to the people, "Come after me." And he's not saying, "Come at me," like, you see on a t-shirt every once in a while now. He's not saying, "Come at me, bro." That's not what he's saying. He's saying, "Come after me. Do what I do. Live the way I live. Follow after me." And he says to come after me, and you see this in that example, let him deny himself. Okay? It's time to put yourself aside and take on me. Come after me. It's time to take up that cross of self-denial. In other words, it's going to be a sacrifice. In order to come after Jesus, there is sacrifice that's involved. It's taking up that cross, and then it's following after him. It's not always going to be doing what I want to do if I am a disciple of Jesus Christ. If I've decided to come after him, then I need to deny myself, make those sacrifices to do so, and follow after him. And that's what those four men show us that they did. In Mark chapter 3, I want to notice some things about discipleship. Mark chapter 3 and verse 7 says, "But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea." Notice that Jesus, or this text here, puts people into two different categories. Both of them, notice, were following Jesus. I think that's really important to notice here, that they both were following Jesus, but some were disciples, others were the part of the multitude that even were following him. And there's the distinction that is made here. The multitudes are fans, and the disciples were participants. You know, when we follow after Jesus, we can be fans of Jesus. We can be ideologically right there with him. We can want what he offers us, and we can generally follow him in some sort of a direction, but that's not what he's talking about with discipleship, is it? He's talking about being in on the play. I don't know if you've ever watched any game shows, but I've watched game shows a few times, and I'm sitting there answering for the person who's supposed to be making the answer. And I find it at home in my recliner, it's really easy to come up with some of those answers. I know the letter for Wheel of Fortune, or I can solve the puzzle well before they do. And you can tell that they don't know yet. Family Feud, I've got the answer. I've got the number one. Why can't you people think of this? I'm not the one on the spot. You see, I'm the one that's a fan. I'm in the crowd. It's different when I'm there and I'm in the middle of the game. And I've got to make those necessary sacrifices in order to be there, and I've got to be conditioned and trained and those types of things to be able to be in that game. You understand the difference between being a fan and being a participant, because that's the difference between being a follower of Jesus Christ and being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Way different. He goes on in Matthew 23 and verse 8. Now, here he's talking to particularly the Pharisees. But here he says, "But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, and you are all brethren." And so he makes a distinction here of this word rabbi and teacher. Now, rabbi means teacher, but this idea of this teacher on the bottom here, those two things, let me go back a little bit, is something different. It means your extreme teacher. It's the one teacher. So if you understand what I'm saying. But let's go to this idea. When we think of a teacher, isn't that the visual that we get? We think of a classroom. We think of a professor. We think of a teacher. We think of somebody up in front of the class, and they're lecturing, perhaps, or maybe they're even engaging you in some way, but that's what we generally think of when we think of teacher, but that's not what rabbi means, and it's certainly not what the teacher means here. In comparison to what we would think of today, this is more like an apprenticeship. That's what being a disciple is. It's that kind of a teacher. You know, we do school different. We do that kind of training different than what they did back then. If you wanted to learn a craft back then, you started very young, and you started working with someone. If you wanted to be a lawyer, you worked with a lawyer. And maybe you're filing paperwork, maybe just copying things over and over again. We didn't have a printing press, so it was just writing stuff over and over again. And by doing that, you learn the law. And he or she works with you, and they teach you how to do that by immersing you in that field, in that craft. And so you give up all these other things so that you could be with that person. You might even live with that person so that you could learn that craft. That's this idea of discipleship, this apprenticeship with Jesus Christ. In Mark 4 and verse 34, notice this. He said, "But without a parable, he did not speak to them. And when they were alone, he explained all things to his disciples." You know, when he was speaking to them, he spoke in a parable. And the scriptures tell us they didn't understand what he was preaching. And his disciples came to him privately and asked him, "Why are you teaching those things?" He said, "They don't want to hear it." They were fans. They weren't disciples. But to the disciples, he explained those things to them so that they understood what Jesus wanted. And that is the difference between being a disciple and being a follower or a fan. Today, brothers and sisters, we are called to be disciples, not fans. Matthew 11 and verse 28, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." This invitation calls for us to learn from Jesus. It's to follow after him. It's to sit at his feet. It's to learn what he did. It's to think as he thought. It's to act like he wants us to act as followers of him. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 40, it says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. So we've been called to learn at the feet of Jesus, to follow after him, to be his apprentice, to be his disciple. And he wants us to be like him. We can't be above him. That's never going to happen. But we need to be like those that sat at the feet of their predecessors, and they learned from those before them. And we need to learn from Jesus Christ. We need to be a student, a dedicated student, an apprentice of Jesus Christ. How do we do that? Jesus tells us some very specific ways in which we can be a disciple. Number one, in Luke 14 and verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Verse 33 says, so likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. It would have done those men no good to continue fishing and try to be an apprentice of Jesus. They couldn't have gone where he went and done what he had done. They couldn't really follow after him unless they had given all that up. And so what Jesus is asking us to do, matter of fact, he says we must do. We cannot be his disciples if we're not willing to forsake it all. That being his disciple is our number one priority, and everything else falls into place after that. And it will fall into place. It'll be in its proper place, and we'll have a different perspective, an eternal perspective. But he tells us there to do that, we've got to forsake all, just like those men did when they gave up fishing. John 8 and verse 31, Jesus to those Jews who believed him, if you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed. Now this one is the one that probably stands out the most, that seems to make the most sense, that if we're going to be students of Jesus Christ, then we need to continue in his word. We need to abide in his word. We need to study his word, because that's what students do. I remember in high school, I could get by a little bit without studying. A little bit. You know, I paid attention in class. I actually went to class, and I paid attention to class. I did a little bit of my homework. I did enough to get what I needed to get and make the grade. When I went to college, though, when I went to class, I had to study. When I didn't go to class, I didn't know what to study. Don't do that. That's a recipe for disaster. But I had to learn how to study when I got to college, because that was career type stuff, right? It's higher learning. That's an apprenticeship with Jesus. It's learning how to study, learning how to continue in his word, being his pupil. The next thing Jesus says in John 13 and verse 13, this is when he had washed the disciples' feet. He says, you call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. And so here he sets an example by washing the feet of the disciples. We've talked about that a little bit this morning. So he washed their feet, and he says, now, if I'm your teacher, if you consider me your teacher, you'll do the same. He continues on. Notice this is the same chapter. It's the same type of premise. Verse 35. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Matter of fact, he gives a new command, and he says, love like I have loved you. And he set the example just earlier in that chapter. So he tells us to be his disciple, to love as he did. That is an humbling love. That is a self-sacrificing love. That's the type of love that Jesus had. And that's the kind of love that he calls his disciples. And how will the world know that we're his disciples? When we love with humility. When we love preferring the other person above ourselves. When we sacrifice ourselves for the good of others. And then, finally, we have In John 15 and verse 8, by this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, so you will be my disciples. So to be his disciples, then, we must bear fruit or grow fruit. We don't really use terms like that today. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how we use certain types of language because we get accustomed to one another. And you know what he's saying here? If you're going to be a student of mine, be a productive student. Produce. Do something. Now, there's ways he talks about bearing fruit and producing. Galatians 5 is one of those. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, etc. The fruit of the Spirit. So as we are his student and we continue in his word, all of this kind of goes together. What is born out? Well, it's the love that he talks about, right? And it's just prior to that, the works of the flesh. Those are not things we do. So you see how it all comes together in this idea of being productive. Another thing that it means to bear fruit is we are all disciples of Jesus Christ. What does an apple tree produce? Apples. How do you know? Because of the fruit. Because of the source. So what does a disciple tree bear? Disciples. So you see how it's being productive. That's what it means to go and grow this fruit. That's what Jesus says is necessary in order for us to be a disciple of his, to be not just a fan, but an apprentice of Jesus Christ, is to forsake all, to continue in his word, to love as he did, and to grow fruit. If it were easy, we'd all do it. The problem is that the world wants to tell you that there's other things that you could be doing than all of that. So don't do that. And then we need to be aware of what the world is going to tell us to do. In Luke chapter 9, verse 57, it says, now it happened as they journeyed on the road that someone said to him, Lord, I will go wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Now notice what he says. He said to another, follow me, but he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Now, reading that, you just think, well, that's an innocent thing, isn't it? The guy's just saying, well, let me go bury my father. My father died. I need to go bury him. Notice the response of Jesus. Sounds harsh. Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and preach the kingdom of God. Man, that sounds harsh, doesn't it? Here it is, his dad died, and he's got to go bury him. And Jesus says, you just come follow me. You go preach the kingdom. You let the dead bury the dead. We go on. Another also said, Lord, I will follow you, but let me first go and bid them farewell who are at my house. Let me go tell my family bye. You're asking me to forsake all. Well, I'll forsake all, but let me go tell them bye. Let me tell them farewell. And again, Jesus said to him, no one having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. Man, that seems really harsh, doesn't it? Jesus tells us to forsake all, but they've got these other things. You know why they're making these different types of excuses? And that's what Jesus was getting to. Jesus wasn't being harsh. When they said, do we want to follow you? He said, birds of the air have nests, foxes have holes. I don't have anywhere to lay my head. You know what that translates to? I'm not going to have anywhere to lay my head. And if I'm not going to have anywhere to lay my head, well, let me first go do this before I go do this. See, they weren't willing to forsake it all. They weren't willing to give it up because they were really comfortable where they were. And when we get too comfortable where we are, that we don't go and do what we need to do, we are not the disciples of Jesus Christ. Because we are called to forsake all. We also see in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, it says, for we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. And these are fancy words to talk about lewdness, which is bad behavior, immodest behavior. We're going to talk about lusts and desires of a sexual nature. Drunkenness, we know what drunkenness is. Revelries is the party lifestyle in this drinking parties. Well, that's getting together to drink. That's the purpose of getting together in these abominable idolatries, following after another god or following after, really anything that would be in the place of God. So he says that we spend enough of our past lifetime doing that. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. So you want to continue in the Word. That's what you're called to do as a disciple. But for you to do that means that you're probably not going to do the same things you used to do, and you're certainly not going to run with the same crowd you used to run with, because you're doing the things that the Word says to do. It changes you. And so what they do is they say, don't change. That's weird. For you to do what you're saying you do, to continue in the Word of Jesus Christ, this outdated book, whatever this God that man has made up or whatever, they think it's strange that you'd be willing to give those things up to follow the Word of Jesus Christ. And so they're going to do anything they can to compel you. They're going to make fun of you. They're going to keep you in as much as they can and say, here, don't be weird. Because they'll think it's strange that you do those things. In 1 John chapter 2 and verse 16 says, for all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. See, what the world tells you is not to love like Jesus loved, but to keep it all for yourself. The love that the world preaches today is a selfish love. The love that Jesus preaches is a selfless love. We tend to be selfish. Jesus knew that. That's why the greatest command, or what we would consider as the golden rule, he says, do unto others as you would have them, what? Do unto you. Because you're going to do for you. So he says, use that to love others. Husbands, love your wives as what? As your own bodies. Because no one hates his own body. He nurses it and cherishes it. He knows you're selfish. So treat your wife like you treat yourself. As a matter of fact, we are called, because we're disciples of Christ, Philippians chapter 3 tells us to love different, or 2 tells us to love differently than that. It means to put the other person first. To exalt them over self. But what is of the world is lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, to keep it for ourselves. We don't want to share. And certainly we're not going to give it up where we can't have it. But that's not the love of Jesus. And then we see in Luke 8 and verse 14, the parable of the sower. He says, now the ones that fell among thorns are those who, when they have heard, go out and are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures of life, and bring no fruit to maturity. This is not talking about people who are evil, that you'd look at them and say, well, these people are extremely sinful, that they've got real problems in their life. You know what? They're just not being productive. They're just too busy. They have responsibilities. That's cares. Riches. That's job and work and trying to possessions and vacations and all kinds of stuff. The pleasures of life, that's really the vacations and the fun and those types of things. Those things get in the way. That means that I'm not going to be productive for Jesus. He says, if you're not going to grow fruit, if you're not going to be productive, you're not his disciple, because that's what it takes. So we can't get too busy. We got to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And so the point I want you to see with all this is that's what the world is going to come at you with. That's what the world wants you to think, that you can't do this, that you can't be a disciple of Jesus Christ for all various kinds of different reasons. Some of that's from within, and some of that is the pressure from others. But we are called to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. And if we are going to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, what Christ compels us to do then is to lead others to be disciples of Jesus Christ. What that means is that the Tulsa Church of Christ needs to create a culture that is conducive to being a disciple. That we need to be the type of people that's holding people by the hand, holding each other by the hand, and leading them to forsake all, to continue in the Word, to love as He did, and to grow fruit. Our job is to promote discipleship. The world will not do it. They will do the exact opposite. So we have to help each other in that arena. We have to be a people that's helping each other be better disciples. And let me show you how we can do that. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7. But the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received the gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. You see, where the world, they don't want you to forsake all those things. They wonder why you do those things. They're going to do everything to keep you from doing that. You have to get out of your comfort zone to do that. And if you have to get out of your comfort zone to forsake all, and you do, then the church needs to be a place of comfort for those who have forsaken what was comfortable to them. Does that make sense? We have to be a safe haven. We have to be a refuge. We have to be a place of love that forgives, that covers a multitude of sins. We need to be a people who is willing to be hospitable because they have forsaken all and now they don't have a home. They've left their father and mother because that's what Christ compelled them to do. Because they came to Jesus Christ, now their family doesn't want to have anything to do with them. We need to step up and be that family. Because if we don't, the world's not going to do it for them. The world's going to try to get them to bring back those things that they have forsaken. And so we need to be that place of safety, that place of refuge, a hospitable people, a people of service to them, because we have the grace of God. Share that grace with them. That's the type of people we need to be that's conducive, the culture that's conducive to forsaking all and having a place of refuge with one another. We need to be each other's family. That's what we need to be. So that when we are forced to forsake other things, we still have each other. Next, we see Acts chapter 2, verse 42. It says, and they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship and in the breaking of bread and in prayers. Then fear came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were done through the apostles. Now all who believed were together, and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and divided them among all, as anyone had need. So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. And it goes on, praising God and having favor with all the people. The Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved, because the church was a place that was conducive. The culture was to continue in the apostles' doctrine, but not on our own. You know, this person over here didn't go do whatever he does to follow after the apostles' doctrine, and this person over here go and do what she does to follow after the apostles' doctrine. No, they were together. They got together. They spent time together in fellowship, in breaking of bread and in prayers. They spent together daily doing those things to continue in the apostles' doctrine, so that they could be good students of Jesus Christ, to be that apprentice that God has called him to be. We need to have a culture where we spend time together talking about, studying, living the words of Jesus Christ. Iron sharpens iron. And we need to be sharpening each other. And when other people think it's strange that we would follow after the Word of God, we need to tell each other that it's weird that people don't. Because we know what the Word of God can do for us. And so that culture needs to be here at Tulsa Church of Christ, that we would promote discipleship through continuing in His Word together. Next, we see Hebrews 10 and verse 24. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Now, specifically, obviously, this is talking about the assembly, but our assembly needs to be of such that we need to have a culture that produces, that promotes love. See, we come together in order to stir up love and good works. And so our culture here in this place needs to be just like it was with Jesus, and we need to be humbly self-sacrificial in our love for one another. And when we come together, when we talk to each other, we notice, again, Acts chapter 2, they had all things in common, so they were together. So whether it's the assembly or whether in private, but what we need to be doing as a church, and certainly in the assembly because it says to do so, we need to be stirring up love within each other. The world tells you just do it. Get what's yours. You got to get to know you before you can do whatever. That's what the world tells you. Not here. Here we need to teach sacrifice. Here we need to teach selflessness. And here we need to stir that up within each of us so that we're that way with one another. And by that, the world will know we're His disciples. And finally, Luke 13 and verse 6. He also spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of his vineyard, look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground? But he answered and said to him, sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well, but if not, after that, you can cut it down. This kind of goes back a little bit to the idea of stirring up love and good works, because that's what we're to do. But notice here, the parable, the idea. They come across this tree. The tree's not been fruitful. It's wasting space, right? I mean, that's basically what it's doing. I can plant another tree that will bear fruit in its place, and even if I have to wait a few years, at least it's not wasting space. This one is just wasting space in my garden. So he gets ready to cut it down. The other one says, let me prepare it. Let me work with it. Let me fertilize it. Let me do stuff to the ground. Let me aerate it a little bit. See if we can get better water, a better dirt. See if we can get nutrients to it that it hadn't been getting, and maybe it'll produce fruit. That's us. We're the ones that should be preparing each other's ground. We should be helping each other be productive. Instead of just saying, you know what, you're a waste of space, and being done with you, we ought to be provoking or stirring up love and good works. Because we're not a waste of space. It's worth it to dig that up. And that's the kind of culture that we need to have, that we're producing fruit. And when we notice someone that's gotten too busy, that's gotten taken away by too many things or whatever, that we're there and we're cultivating that. I want you to notice, he did not do the violent thing, which is to rip it up and throw it out. He babied it. He took care of that thing. And sometimes when people are so busy, they've got all these other things going on, they don't know it. Sometimes you just have to baby them along, and that's okay. We need to have the kind of culture at Tulsa Church of Christ where we're just helping people be productive. That's the idea. So Jesus, as we all know, he died. 3 days later, he was resurrected. He was seen by some women, and had even been seen by the apostles. But after spending 3 years together with Jesus, side by side with him, following in his footsteps, seeing his miracles, learning all the lessons that the multitude didn't hear, but that they got the pleasure to hear. Jesus was now away from them for a little while. In John 21 and verse 3, Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we're going with you also. They went out and immediately got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. After 3 years of being a pupil of Jesus Christ, being an apprentice of his, what did they do? Well, Jesus was done, right? Well, I'll go fishing. I'll just go back to what I did before. That's what they said. That's what they decided to do. Notice this. But when the morning had come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, children, have you any food? They answered him, no. Remember, they caught nothing, so they don't have any food. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. You have to imagine what was going on in their head. They've been fishermen for a long time prior to this. Here this guy standing on the shore, and he says, cast it on the other side. Okay. I don't know why. I don't know what the point is. We haven't caught anything all night, but whatever, dude. We'll do this, right? That's what I picture. So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of fish. Oh, man, how'd this guy know? Remember, they didn't know it was Jesus. But therefore, that disciple whom Jesus loved, that is John, said to Peter, it is the Lord. You think? Now, when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. So Peter was this one that said, you know what? I'm going fishing. They all said, okay, we'll go with you. We'll go back to what we were doing before we were disciples of Jesus Christ, because we were done. And then Jesus shows up, says, cast your net on the other side after they caught nothing. All this stuff, all this fish, they couldn't even hold it. Now Peter was like, whoo, it's the Lord. Because John said that, and Peter recognized it. He didn't wait for the boat to dock. He didn't try to get over there. He just dove into the sea so that he could go as quickly as he could get to Jesus. Now the rest of them, they followed him with that net, trying to pull that up. And they got to Jesus. Jesus said, let's make some breakfast. What do you think fishermen have for breakfast? They have fish. So while they're eating the fish, Jesus says to Peter, do you love me more than these? You know what he's asking him? Do you love me more than you love fishing? Do you love me more than your job? Peter said, well, yes, I love you. He said, then feed my sheep. So a second time, Jesus says, do you love me? Peter says, you know, Lord, that I love you. And he said, feed my sheep. And in John 21 and verse 17, he said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? We all would be there at this moment. Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, oh, Jesus, Lord, you know that I love you. You keep asking me. And I keep telling you that I love you. You know that I love you. He said, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. Now, this is about his death, but it's also about forsaking what he has forsaken. You know, before we become a disciple of Christ, when you're younger, you can do whatever you want. You can live however you want to. But when you become a disciple of Jesus Christ, you do what he wants and what he wants you to do. But this is about his death. He says, you got to do whatever you want to do, but when you're old, you're going to stretch out your hands, and they're going to dress you, and They're going to carry you away, and you don't want to go where you're going. It's going to be that kind of a death. That's what he's telling Peter. How do I know that? Well, the next verse says so. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. You see, his discipleship wasn't over. Just because Jesus had completed that part of his journey on this earth did not mean that he was no longer a disciple. Matter of fact, it meant more so. Now he's to do that for all. Now he's to feed the sheep. What that means to you and me is Jesus has called us to follow him. And if we are truly following him as disciples of Jesus Christ at Tulsa Church of Christ, we are to feed the sheep. We are to promote discipleship here. Let's create that culture together.